What's up, everybody? Welcome to the 4040 Vision podcast. I'm your host, Khaled Abdallah, and I'm joined today by a special guest, Brenden Nunes, Kings reporter for SacTown Sports 1140, host of the Kings Pulse podcast, and contributor to the Kings Beat. So he covers all things Sacramento Kings. How you doing today, man?
I'm doing good, man. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course. I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on. And today we're talking about the Vivek era. So I know that's a good span of time. We're coming up on 12 years now, 13 years of the Vivek era. So we're going to start way in the beginning. So back in 2013, Vivek comes in, saves the day. The Kings are looking. I mean, I was living in the Bay Area at the time, but it seemed like, for all intents and purposes, the Kings were headed to Seattle. And then Vivek comes in. So what was the mood around the city when that happened?
Yeah, I also was in the Bay Area for what it's worth at the time, but I've been around the team long enough for a handful of years now that I've gotten all this backstory and work with a lot of people that were actually very involved with a lot of the relocation saga. It was an entire push by the city to try and keep the team here, and as far as people within Sacramento's local government got involved, and Vivek stepping in really is what saved the team. And I think that gave him so much good grace. He obviously was a minority owner with the Golden State Warriors, and then, just gets to move right down the road over here to Sacramento. So I think there was a lot of hope for sure. Everybody thought the team was fully gone. There was the Woj tweet that said they were on their way to Seattle. They thought it was fully on the way. And so there is still a lot of pride in this city about managing to keep them here and what that meant. And I'm sure we'll get into this as we go further into this, but it bought Vivek a lot of good graces in the city, obviously. Like, keeping the team is priority number one. They'd rather have this horrible team, which is the reality of what they're dealing with right now. We're doing this as they've lost 8 straight and are 3-12 in the Western Conference. It is, and they're old. It's not like it's a young team doing this. You don't have Derek Queen and Jeremiah Fears, at least, to get a little excited about. But it bought Vivek a lot of good graces, deserved, because kept the team here. And there was so much of a push by everybody in the city for that to happen. So I think once that finally was locked in, it was a sigh of relief. And these fans love this team. This is the only major sports team in this city. It is very embraced. And for all the bad years that they've seen, any player that comes through will tell you, like DeMarcus Cousins, De'Aaron Fox, these guys will all talk about how it was never the fans. They always showed out. It's not quite selling out currently, but you can't really blame them for that. It's sold out a lot for how poor the product has been. And I think that's a credit to the fans that fought so hard to keep them here. And Vivek deserves his credit for that too.
Yeah, the fans built the reputation in the early 2000s of just being rabid fans. It almost felt like, watching those Kings teams, the Divock, the Bibby teams, it was like a college atmosphere. It was like the Camden Crazies type thing. They had the cowbell, all that stuff. So it was really rowdy. And I'm sure that huge sigh of relief came, and like you said, it bought him a lot of time. And I mean, how involved was he early on? Was he super hands-on? And I think maybe that led to some of the instability around the team.
Would definitely say so. Some of the people have pointed out to me that the high turnover that exists in the tech world, and that's where Vivek is coming from, obviously. And don't get me wrong, this could be because there is just so much what the heck is going on with the Kings that people just try and connect the dots in any way possible. But essentially, yes, Vivek was fairly involved early on. I think a lot of the pattern of what you're going to see here is him sort of having a right-hand man, right? Like Jerry Jones runs the show in Dallas, but he's going to have his right-hand man that he's still, and probably a couple of them that he's still going to bounce ideas off of. It's just that probably should be your general manager. And usually it seems like there's a third party, sort of, and that can cause some rifts, obviously. But not long after him taking over, they're going through the Mike Malone saga happens not long after, where he gets fired very early into his second season with the team. And obviously everybody knows what Mike Malone goes on to do. And
it was 2 months into the season, right? If I remember right.
Yes, yeah. It was very early into the year, which is why when Doug Christie has the start that he has right now, I look around and I'm like, well, they fired Mike Brown 20-some games into a season. They fired Mike Malone really early into a season. So I start to wonder a little bit, especially because this is the same ownership that we're talking about. So yeah, Mike Malone, and then we go Ty Corbin in that season. And then George Karl even closes out the year, which I think is also a little bit of a theme of George Karl being this guy that obviously is probably headed for the Hall of Fame. I don't know. He might
Yeah,
even already be
for
in there.
sure.
I'm not sure. I'm not educated, to be honest, on a bunch of George Karl history. But obviously, like coming from the Sonics and all the time that he had successful as a coach, like I think that we see this team put a lot of stock into the past, essentially. And George Karl goes on to coach that entire next season. He gets into it with Boogie. I hear a lot of stories about George Karl kind of being a jerk a little bit during his times here, and I think in
He's
previous places. That's a little
a
bit of
tough
just
guy.
George
I
Karl.
mean, yeah, he's a tough guy to deal with. I mean, you look at the relationship he has with Carmelo, who was probably the best player he ever coached, and they don't have a great relationship. I think a lot of players have come out against him, essentially saying like maybe he's borderline racist. I don't know. I mean, just
Yeah.
weird allegations coming his way.
Yeah, and obviously didn't vibe well with the players. You could see why Boogie, of all people, is not really going to mesh with that guy. But to answer your question, yes. And I think that it's one thing that I will preface this all with, because this is going to be kind of the going in on Vivek episode, as he deserves. The one thing I think he does deserve credit for, or just should be acknowledged, is that he does care. Like what we talked about at the beginning of like the keeping the team here, right? And understanding what it means to this city. Like he bought the team, and this is another freaking level of rich, but he bought the team because his daughter is absolutely obsessed with basketball. And again, that's another
Must be
level of
nice. Yeah.
rich, right? Like that's crazy. But she's also more involved than probably should be. I don't know the extent of that still being the case, but has been in years prior, and his family and things like that. But you own a team, like of course I'm going to pass it on to my kids, like them being
Mhm.
involved. There is a proper way to do it probably, and just instantly making your daughter assistant general manager of your Stockton team is probably not the correct way to do that. But I get it to an extent, right? And I do think he cares and is trying to make the team good. It's just you should probably let the people that know basketball be the ones making the decisions. So, yes, very much involved, I think, for the reasons of trying to turn this around and replicate the Warriors that he came from, and are right down
Mhm.
the way for what it's worth in a lot of different ways. But a lot of missteps along the way, clearly. And that was the case at the beginning as well.
Yeah, I think it's a very common phenomenon we see of this new owner syndrome. We saw it in Phoenix with Matt Ishbia. I think that's the most recent example of someone coming in and they think that they're going to take whatever skill set, expertise they had from their other industry, which is not like sports at all, whether it's tech or real estate, or I think it was the mortgage industry where Ishbia is coming from. They're like, oh, we'll just throw a bunch of money at things and we'll pivot and do things quickly, and and you end up with 4 coaches and 4 GMs, I think, in the first 9 years of the Vivek era. And I think the biggest decision he made in those early seasons was trading away Boogie Cousins. So I want to talk about that situation. What the logic was behind it was, I know Boogie is not the easiest person to deal with. I'm sure he's a tough guy to work with, but he is a superstar. He was a superstar at one point. So what was the logic behind that move, and how much of it was Vivek just maybe getting tired of the Boogie act?
Yeah, the playoff drought obviously had gone on for a long time already at that point, and continued to go on after that for about a decade, which is pretty insane. But funnily enough, at that point in the season when they traded Boogie at the deadline, like Rudy Gay's on that team, Isaiah Thomas is on that team, they actually were playing well. And it looked like they
Yeah.
could make the postseason. And it was to the point where some of the guys I talked to now had even reported that the Boogie extension was done, and that was fully had been completed. And
And that was Dave
essentially,
Yeager coaching, right, at the time?
yes.
Good, respected
And
coach. Yeah.
yeah, Dave did pretty well. I think eventually, yeah, that all kind of got played out after a certain point, but it was essentially, yeah, they unsure about the future of the team and where they were headed. And I don't think that they loved Boogie as the leader of the team. And Boogie definitely had his own flaws. Like Jimmer Fredette is one that people will point to as Boogie may have sort of killed his confidence. And, you could knock
Tell me
Jimmer.
more about that. Tell me more about that.
I think it's just that Boogie would really go at people
Mhm.
in the locker room, and everything that I was told is like, hey, if Boogie was good with you, like he's super nice, but he was going to test people essentially.
Mm.
And he's the star of the show. So when Jimmer comes in and is has all the fame and name behind him that he does. I think Boogie tested that a little bit in certain ways, and I don't think that necessarily benefited Jimmer, and I think it was different than probably what he was accustomed to, obviously being the guy at BYU and everything like that. So, I would say that, not necessarily saying that like, oh, Jimmer would have a totally different career. Like he probably just has his own flaws as a player as well. But I don't think it helps a rookie's confidence. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? And there's certain guys that would argue, well, like, hey, if you can't handle that, then you can't handle X, Y, and Z. So take it for what you will. But those sort of things going on, right? And Boogie kind of having that demeanor a little bit, and not really getting along with ownership and previous head coaches and things like that, and the money that they were about to pay him, I think just kind of all culminated at that point, and they decided it was best to move on. And for
Hmm.
what it's worth, like you can't really predict it, but Boogie didn't exactly play out that entire contract. Like the
He
the
did
first
not.
couple
You're
years, they
right.
look phenomenal, right? They look like world beaters. Everybody's like, oh my God, they're gonna turn that around. And then Boogie goes down and just
Yeah.
was never
I
the
mean, that
same
team was
since.
scary. That
Yeah.
that New Orleans team with him and AD. I mean, until he gets hurt. But yeah, that was a scary team for a little while.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think essentially they wanted a different lead guy. And when it comes down to the point of, all right, we really have to cash this guy out, like I think that's where the decision gets made of, is this worth it or not? And they
Hmm.
clearly were unsure. We see them be unsure a lot in more instances that we're going to dive further into. And yeah, I think just ended up settling last minute on it. Wouldn't surprise me if there was a rift in the room of, maybe front office felt one way, ownership felt another, and why there was conflicting reports in each direction, but ultimately
Yeah.
decide to move on.
Yeah, it seemed like the relationship between Boogie and the team was broken when the Mike Malone firing happened, because it seemed, I mean, he was pretty outspoken about it from what I remember. He really
Yeah.
liked Mike Malone as a coach. He ends up playing for him later in Denver. So how much of that was, a factor in the severing of that relationship?
I think that definitely factored in. And it's ironic because it's exactly what led to De'Aaron leaving is the Mike Brown firing. It's at some point these players are going to look around and be like, all right, man, like I got to play for the same coach for a couple years in a row. Like at what point are we going to pick a guy, And same with some of the surrounding pieces. Like Rudy's good, but Rondo comes in and out, and Isaiah Thomas doesn't end up sticking around very long. Like I think it is that for sure, like where you finally are like, oh my God, we have a good coach, and then you let him go that quickly in reaction to a poor start. I think definitely factored into the Boogie thing, but it's really a culmination of all the previous instances of, man, we're really doing this again.
Yeah, and I definitely want to talk about De'Aaron Fox and that whole saga, because it seems like, especially as a small market team, getting a guy like that is what you hope for, right? In the draft, someone that's a legitimate superstar when healthy, and he's the type of guy that can take your team and that playoff drought, maybe take your team deep into the playoffs. So, what was the mood when they finally hit on a draft pick? Because I mean, famously, the Kings are not great at the top of the draft, which we could talk about a little bit. But what was it like when they finally hit on a guy like De'Aaron?
Yeah, what's ironic is I think they actually owned the number 3 pick technically in that draft, because Boston and Philly swap 1 and 3. And when the Kings acquired, I believe they dumped Rondo and someone else to get Nick Stauskas to clear cap space to sign Nick Stauskas. Or I could have those names a little bit backwards, but they sent off unprotected picks to dump salary and sign some guys that were not very good. And those picks end up going to Philadelphia. That was the 3rd pick, and it was a swap. So technically, they should have even been the 3rd pick, and that's where Tatum ends up going, right? So technically could be even better, but they hit on De'Aaron at 5. They get lucky in that lottery even with the odds that they did have. And so I think it was De'Aaron took a second to really become great. It wasn't necessarily like the moment he got in there. George Hill was still starting over him pretty early on, and then he eventually takes that over. But there were enough flashes early on. But he's one of those players it's like early Jaylen Brown and some of those guys so reliant on athleticism that they almost look like they're just kind of falling everywhere that they go early. And I think it took them a sec to learn to play at different paces rather than just 100% all the time. But you saw those flashes a little
Yeah,
bit. And I
for
think
sure.
there definitely was a sense of hope with what De'Aaron was bringing, and then you go into that next draft and they bring in Marvin, and Marvin had a great first year, actually. Like, don't get me wrong, everybody was like very much, why did they not take Luka? That's not even in hindsight. Like,
We definitely need to talk about that.
in
Yeah,
the
for
moment,
sure.
everybody's like, what are we doing here? But point being, at that point, there was this era of like super team just young, of
Hmm.
De'Aaron Fox, Bogdan Bogdanovic, Justin Jackson comes in that same draft as De'Aaron Fox. Frank Mason is like part of the bench mob at that point. He's the same draft as De'Aaron Fox. You have Harry Giles that everybody was super excited about at the time. So this is like when they were young and there was a feeling of, okay, the next generation is starting to work its way in.
Yeah. And then, I mean, you talked about the Luka Marvin Bagley draft. How much of the De'Aaron already being there was a factor in passing over Luka and saying, maybe we already have a point guard, we don't need another one?
I think it definitely was a factor, but I think the main thing is that they really didn't think there was that much of a talent gap between the two guys. And that maybe that put it over the line, right? Hey, well, we think these guys are pretty even and we already do have a point guard. I like, it felt more like that rather than primarily being, we don't have a point guard, like we can't take this guy even though we think he's better. I think there was just a slight misevaluation in that draft a little bit. And there's the infamous, like, Vlade went to dinner with Luka's dad, and people talk about that. I don't really know how much stock to put into all that. I don't think there's that much to it for what it's worth. I think it was more than anything just poor evaluation. And for what it's worth, a lot of people had Bagley really, really high in that draft. It's not like he was viewed as some bust prospect. It's just that Luka was like the clear number one. I can't really fault them for taking Bagley over like Jaren Jackson or Trae Young, honestly, or guys like that. It's really just that at the time, I remember a Reddit user. I love Reddit for God knows why,
It's
but
great.
in
It's
the
terrible, but it's
Kings
great.
Reddit, it's great for that reason.
Yeah.
In the Kings Reddit, there was this guy that prior to the lottery was like forecasting the Kings are going to jump up to number 2 and they're going to pick Luka. And they jumped to number 2 in the lottery. And I remember the whole Reddit being like, oh my God, it's happening. Like, this guy's a prophet, blah, blah, blah. And then they don't pick Luka. Point being, everybody knew at the time you should pick Luka. I think they just misevaluated it a little bit and thought that Bagley was close enough to on par with Luka that they thought the fit mattered enough at that point.
I mean, and to be fair, they're not the only ones that passed up on him. I mean,
Yes.
it was such a weird draft with, I mean, the Suns, they go number 1, they hire Luka's national team coach.
Yes.
So you're like, okay, it's obviously going to be Luka in Phoenix, but they picked DeAndre Ayton. And then, I mean, of course, Sac passes him up, even though you're like, okay, there's that, former Yugoslavia connection with Vlade and Luka's dad. They know each other. I think they used to play together at some point, if I'm not mistaken. So you're like, okay, that's an easy connection right there. And then, of course, Atlanta, they pass up on him too to take Trae Young. I think they trade up to get Trae Young over Luka. So I think it's just like results based, like because the Kings haven't had as much success as the Suns making the finals, the Hawks making the conference finals. So I think they get the most flack for it. But I mean, it's not like he went 2 and the Kings picked Bagley 1. So, there's a lot of blame to go around. I'll say that. But so, yeah, it was a strange draft. So I do want to keep talking about De'Aaron, and you mentioned about the Mike Brown firing being a big reason why he left. So my understanding was, I mean, it seems like I'm wrong, was that he wasn't a fan of Mike Brown and he was kind of pushing Mike Brown out. Do I have that backwards?
Yeah. It's kind of funny because this was reported very weirdly.
Yeah, it really was.
This was very much, there was the reporting from essentially De'Aaron's side and from the team side, right? And everything from my understanding, and De'Aaron was transparent enough to say as much in multiple occasions, including to me, that like he told the front office in that offseason prior to, so you'll remember they had the Beam Team year, and then they have one more year after where they're a little bit disappointing. They play Golden State in the play-in. They don't make the playoffs, right?
They're still over 500 though. And they
won 36 games and they only won 38 in that year. Or I'm sorry, I have this backward. They won 46 games that year. They won 48 in the year, the Beam Team year. They only won 2 less games. Like that's the year. The Beam Team year is when Denver won, and you'll hear like Michael Porter Jr. and take Michael Porter Jr.'s words for what it's will. But like he's and other Denver guys have come out and said like that was kind of a down year in the West, like when it comes
It
down
was.
to it, you know? So
I mean,
they only
48
lose
wins
two
isn't
more
usually
games.
good enough for a
No,
3 seed, but that's what the
no.
Kings got. So, yeah.
Yeah, it was all tight right there, and they managed to. They won a lot of close games. De'Aaron wins the first clutch player of the year. That's the I'm nice year, the I'm effing nice year, and all that. And the organization internally is kind of freaking out. They're like, we need to do something. Like we thought that it essentially feels like they think that success is linear, and it's just not. They ran back the exact same team the next year. You weren't catching anybody off guard with how you were playing necessarily, and you didn't win quite as many close games. You lose two more. Mike Brown is going into his final year. Coaches don't really play out their final year, so he's kind of in an extension window. And the Kings were unsure about bringing him back, which I think is crazy. They were unsure, though. And De'Aaron Fox went to ownership or maybe general manager, whoever it may have been, and said, if I play for another coach, it will be for a different organization. He was writing for Mike Brown to that extent, saying like, I want to play for Mike Brown. Like, and essentially that I'm tired of this. You know, I've been here 7.5 years. I don't know how many coaches, 5 coaches, whatever it may have been. And all this turnover, he's constantly asking for like, and Darren wasn't trying to get overly involved, but his thought is like, can we get some wing players in here? And then they go and draft Davion Mitchell. They go and draft Devin Carter or different guys like that. And like Keegan Murray is one of De'Aaron's closest friends in the NBA. Like, it's probably obviously more of a personality thing, but I find it funny that it's the one wing they actually drafted. So De'Aaron was very much, I think, already on the edge of like, man, we have a good team here. Like, if we mess this up, like if the Kings do the Kings thing, essentially, then I'm going to be over this. And so he let them know, hey, if you let go of Mike Brown, I plan to play for a different coach. And they reluctantly extend Mike Brown. He has a 6-game losing streak, 20-some games into the season. They fire him, bring Doug Christie in. De'Aaron likes Doug Christie and everything. They have a good relationship because Doug's been around the team since De'Aaron has been drafted, obviously. But De'Aaron already had in his mind, like, hey, this is how this is going to go, And so I think that at that point, called it essentially and was like, I would like to go to the Spurs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess that's essentially how that sort of all went down. But definitely, De'Aaron was very much in Mike Brown's corner, and there was a split in the locker room in general. I would say, like, I think Sabonis was less Mike Brown, and so it wasn't necessarily everybody was pushing in Mike Brown's direction, and they more so chose the Sabonis Doug Christie route rather than the Mike Brown De'Aaron Fox route, if that makes sense.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, like I said, the way it was reported was not that. Basically, it seemed like that's why it kind of caught me off guard that he asked for a trade, because the way the team made it seem, or the way some of the reporting made it seem, was that he was not in the Mike Brown party or whatever, that side. So he was not pushing for that move, but he would have been happy about that move, and that would have led to him, sticking around and continuing his career. So, but I do want to I definitely want to talk about Sabonis, but I want to talk about the, maybe turning point for the team, which was probably like the 2020-21 season, where they hire Monte McNair. And it seemed like Vivek maybe learned his lesson at that point, that he needs to take a step back from the basketball side of things. How accurate is that?
I think that it's easy for that to be the case when you like first hire someone, right? Like right now with Scott Perry, like all the conversation is that he has full autonomy to do whatever he wants. Now that the team is 3-12, I question that very much.
We'll see how long that lasts. Yeah.
Right, for sure. But I think when a guy first comes in, it's easy to just like hand over the reins. You're like, all right, let me just see what you got before I put my hands over this as well, essentially. And I think we got that early on. Like the Tyrese trade is kind of crazy, and it was very short-sighted. I don't think anybody thought that Tyrese would become the star that he is.
Absolutely not.
Certainly not coming out of the draft, but there were some things that happened while he was in Sac that like year and a half that you were like, oh, there might be more here than like we realized. Not number one player taking a team to the finals level, don't get me wrong, but So they go out and get Sabonis and make some other
Definitely want to talk about that trade for sure.
yeah, make some other tertiary moves as well. But main thing is that they just kind of like had an identity finally. Like they were playing super fast and they played together. The spacing that they got between Keegan Murray in the draft, which was also a little bit of a spicy pick. Like I think most people
I
thought
remember,
Jaden
yeah.
Ivey should go there. I was definitely in the Jaden Ivey camp.
I remember listening to, I think it was the Simmons and Russillo pod after the draft. They're doing a live pod, I think, and they bust out laughing. It was like, here come the Kings again, and I mean, that just shows you like the draft is such a crapshoot, because I definitely think they made the right pick in that
In hindsight,
situation.
it looks
Yeah,
like the right pick, which is funny. Yeah, like I said, I was definitely team Jaden Ivey at the time. I was team like, hey, this team needs a future. You know, like they need something to hope for down the line. But Keegan ends up looking great. We'll see what sort of player he becomes future wise. But they had that shooting, they had Malik Monk shooting, they had Kevin Herter shooting, and really getting spacing around De'Aaron and Domas helped them thrive. And Sabonis worked great next to Fox and vice versa. Like they clicked right away. There's this sort of funny picture of them hugging each other post game after the first game that Sabonis played as a member of the Kings. And Kings fan joked about it because De'Aaron's like, oh my God, I finally got a good player on my team, you know? So they clicked pretty quick. And I think just getting the proper spacing around them and a good coach in that lead spot with Mike Brown really helped. And I think Luke Walton actually might have still been there that first year that Monty took over, if I have this correct. But eventually, once Mike comes in, they bring in all that shooting. That's where that beam team year happens because they play with such a clear identity of this pace and space. They're essentially playing offense like the Golden State Warriors in a way without having the off ball threat of Steph Curry. And defensively, still not very good, but they were the number one offense. They were the best offense of all time when it came to offensive rating that one season.
yeah, I do remember that. I mean, that was like a special mix of guys where you have, you know, your superstars and they had the talent around them. I mean, Malik Monk was like found money at the time. He was, I think, basically, I think he was waived by the Lakers or something. It was like almost a afterthought where they brought him in. Same thing with Kevin Herter. So they had like this nice mix of guys who were probably, you know, cut too soon by their previous teams, and they had a great fit. So at what point did Vivek say, all right, at what point did he get involved again, you know, with Monte McNair and his decisions? Because obviously he's not on the team anymore. He's not part of the team anymore. So when did that relationship sour?
I really think it's that second season where, again, they lose 2 less games and the year after the Beam Team year. And there was a stretch where they were heavily linked to OG Anunoby and Pascal Siakam.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember a game where Toronto even came into town and Pascal Siakam's like warming up on the court. And you see Masai and Monty actively having a conversation. And then Shams tweets that the Kings have pulled out of any Pascal Siakam conversations.
Mm.
And so they don't go down in that direction. But I think that ownership was like, well, like you're not doing anything. So I'm going to do something essentially. And they go sign DeMar DeRozan in the offseason. You know, they're hesitant to bring Mike Brown back. And then sort of everything happens in that one year. But it felt like essentially when they did not continue on that linear trajectory, which is unrealistic for NBA teams, ownership was like, hey, well, we have to do something. And to be fair, maybe they probably should have done one of those moves. I think in hindsight, like if you look at where did it all go wrong, that's
Mm.
probably the answer is that they needed to do something. But who's not to say that patience wasn't necessarily the right move? Like you could have came into something else in the off season, you know, or further down the line. And Monty and them were still around in that off season. And to be fair, didn't really do much then either. But that is probably the answer of where you needed to do something. And they saw nothing going on, and the team lose a few more games, didn't like the direction it was going. And so, yeah, the good graces of, hey, pretty much do whatever you want lasted about a year. It felt like a year and a half, maybe, because he bought good graces winning. I mean, you win executive of the year, you have the unanimous coach of the year, you have the clutch player of the year. It's hard to really step on anybody's toes at that point. But when the following year is not going how you envisioned, at some point they intervene.
Yeah, and that was a weird summer after the Beam Team. It seemed like we were all waiting for something to happen, for them to make some kind of move. And I think all they ended up doing was bringing Harrison Barnes in, or extending Harrison Barnes, something like that. It was like a very like, oh, we're just going to roll with the team that we had last year and just keep things going. And I think you've said it a couple times, is that growth wasn't linear, where, you know, they ended up taking a small step back, not a, there was a big step back in the standings, but not a huge step back, in terms of win totals and things like that. But I do want to talk about the Beam team, which was a rare bright spot. They end which is crazy to say, 16-year playoff drought. So you've been covering the team for a while. What was that year like compared to some of the other years that you've experienced covering the team?
That was electric. That one almost feels like a fever dream now because yeah, I mean the city was totally on a high. Like they were playing great basketball, and more than anything, it felt like they were trending in the right direction, right? And I think that's where most of the hope came from, was that like, yeah, well, it's not going to stop here. But that first playoff game back, like, I think that is probably going to be a high moment in some of these guys' career, of like, everybody has talked about like coming out that tunnel 30 minutes before the game started and the stadium is already packed. Like, that was an electric environment. They host a game 7 where Steph Curry goes and drops 50. I always remember it as the Kevon Looney game, to be honest, because his offensive rebounds just absolutely killed the Kings. But
Very underrated guy. He was.
I love Kevon Looney.
I remember Sac Media before that series. They had him circled. They're like, "Oh, Sabonis is going to kill this guy."
Yeah.
And then obviously didn't quite
I
go
do
that
remember
way.
this.
But
I think my friend tweeted that and got a lot of crap for it. So that was a funny moment for sure. But yeah, I mean, I think that it definitely was an electric time. Like, everybody was obviously loving it. They felt like there was a future to the core of De'Aaron and Domas, but they just needed to get one more guy. And that the surrounding pieces were solid, and like maybe Keegan could be that guy. Not that much hope in it, but they also had him sitting there just being drafted. So I think there was definitely a lot of hope about what the future would look like of the Kings. Like, hey, we have a good coach in place, and it just felt like everything was trending in the right direction. You have an identity as a group, which is something they lack now and have lacked for a long time prior to that. It's really like their identity is the Kangs, is kind of being the joke of the league. Like, I've been telling people recently, like, it almost feels like they exist just so other fan bases can be like, hey, it could be worse. Like, so yeah, I mean, I think that everything felt great in that moment, and it was all pushing in the right direction. Internally, it all felt great in that one year. Now, like I mentioned, it starts to pick up a little bit more in that following season, which is kind of crazy to me. But yeah, that one year was the one year where there really was not that much drama taking place.
yeah, it was quiet. I mean, that was, I think, my first or second year back on the West Coast living in Sacramento. So I got to experience it firsthand, and it felt a lot like the We Believe Warriors team from back in the day, where it's like, there's a ceiling on this team, but nobody gave a shit because it was so exciting, so new. And then of course the expectations come in, and I think that's the problem, is when you start expecting to win versus just enjoying the wins as they come. That's where that disappointment comes. And I think it's a harsh lesson, right? In team building, and you've said it a few times, is that this stuff isn't linear. We see it all the time in the NBA, where you think you have this window and you can keep building on this foundation that you have, but one misstep here, meddlesome owner there, and all of a sudden you're kind of back to square one. So when it comes to Vivek, what's his level of involvement right now? I mean, you said they're giving Scott Perry, full autonomy. The clock is ticking, it seems like. So what's his role right now, and what's his reputation among, in NBA circles right now?
Yeah, I mean, everybody says what I mentioned earlier, that Scott Perry, general manager currently, has full autonomy to do whatever he wants. I struggle to believe that, to be honest, just because of the history of the team. But his reputation currently is that, for sure, that he meddles, and that he, every time there's a decision that's made, like, I think Kings fans reasonably question, like, was this Vivek or was this the general manager? And it's hard to gauge. But yeah, I mean, I think that's very much the reputation that he's dealing with right now. And the impression that they are giving off is that Scott gets to do what he wants. They are 3-12 right now. So I currently am kind of just waiting. I'm like, this feels like where Vivek steps in and is like, man, I have to do something. And I could have that read wrong, because again, everybody says that's not the case, but that's, to answer your reputation question, I think that's why that leads to that.
Yeah. And it's been a weird offseason, another weird offseason, where I feel like anyone, even a casual NBA fan, would take a look at this roster and say, what's the goal here? What was the vision behind giving Dennis Schroeder 3 years and then bringing in Russell Westbrook? So, I mean, Is there any justification for the way this roster was constructed and the way the team is currently set up?
Yeah, I think the goal was definitely, they said it a lot, was to build an identity here this year. And it was really funny to hear them be like, well, we didn't have a point guard all of last year, so it was hard to gauge. I'm like, you did have a point guard. You traded him away in the middle of the year. So that's the logic behind bringing Dennis Schroeder in, is like, hey, we have no point guard. Now, you probably could have gone in a different direction. Like, he doesn't provide any sort of spacing. You already don't have much shooting on this team. Excuse me. The Russell Westbrook thing was waiting in the wings for a while, and it felt like they needed to clear an opportunity for him to play before he came in. Keegan gets hurt, and that sort of opens up that opportunity, and all of a sudden Russell Westbrook's the starting 4 on the Sacramento Kings, which is crazy. But so I guess I see the logic in like the types of players that you're bringing in, but the specific ones and the lack of shooting more than anything, I think is clearly a flaw that's playing out right now.
Yeah, they're, I think, 30th or 29th in the league in 3-point attempts. And it's like, it's not a modern basketball team when it comes to the space. I mean, maybe in 2005, this team is more competitive, or 2015, because all these guys would have been in their prime. And a lot of people made oh, this is an NBA 2K roster where people just throw together some recognizable names. But what do you think is the biggest challenge right now for the Kings to get back to, even just contending for a playoff spot?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing is just that they don't have a foundation in any sort of way. Like, they don't have a star player. That's the hardest part to find in all of this. And I don't think De'Aaron was a true number one necessarily, but he could almost act as one in a way, right? And like function as that number one player on your team. You have a ceiling probably if that's the case. I think he's well fit as a number 2 where he is right now in San Antonio, but you don't have that number 1 player. And I think that's where you can find a little bit of hope in this season, is like, man, they're right there with the bottom of the league, and they've had the hardest schedule up to this point. They have the easiest remaining, so maybe that will even out, but you almost don't want that because this draft is fairly loaded from my understanding. I'm not super locked in on all the prospects quite yet, but I think that that's where you could find some hope, is like, man, they're going to get a pick. And that's where this could turn around a little bit. They have all of their draft capital. They have a future first from Minnesota, where I think the thought is maybe it won't be there by that time. I don't know that that's actually going to play out that way, but that's where you optimistic take, right? But the issue currently is that they have no identity. Like, and again, that was their goal coming into this year, was to set that in place. I think they have only furthered the poor stigma that is the Kings, and I think that they're almost unintentionally leaning further into that identity and doing the exact opposite of what they had wanted. So it only takes just the right team to scrap that. Obviously, we saw that with that Beam team year, and I think it changes very, very quickly. We talked about it before. I think it was before the recording. It might have been during the conversation about how like the Warriors before were horrible. They were essentially the Kings, and it's like, I mean, you have to get your Steph Curry. Don't get me wrong. Like, Steph Curry's not just going to be sitting there, but you get a star player and you can turn things around. Detroit, like they actually are an example of some linear growth here, right?
Great example. Yeah.
But you get your Cade Cunningham. Like, the Kings have seen so many teams rebuild in the amount of time that they have essentially refused to do so. Like, I remember OKC was sort of a laughing stock for a couple years, and a lot of Kings fans are kind of laughing at them of like, man, this is embarrassing. Like, you're telling Al Horford to go sit at home. You're not even playing these guys, and look at them right now. Like, you've seen multiple teams actually embrace the rebuild and not try to fight it and try to save their current scenario, which I guess would be my fear with this current squad. And I don't think they're going to do that, but that would be sort of the Kings move, is to go and trade for like D'Angelo Russell feels very Kings, or Ja Morant feels very Kings. He doesn't feel very Scott Perry for what it's worth. Like, Scott Perry is constantly mentioning these 6 core foundations, and I don't have them all off the top of my head, but essentially like accountable, professional, team-oriented, disciplined, those sort of things. I would say Ja Morant doesn't exactly fit into that, So that makes me think probably not in the jaw direction specifically, but currently they just, I mean, the main thing I've been saying is they have nothing they're good at, which is crazy. Mm-hmm. Like, not a single thing that they are legitimately good at. Normally it's like, hey, well, this is a good rebounding team, like, or they definitely can shoot. Like, the Kings actually have nothing they are good at right now, which is crazy. They have individual players that are good, but just no sort of cohesion. So I think doing what they set out to do this season and changing the identity and the way that this team is looked at is the right way to approach that. The execution was just poor, obviously. And I think, again, where you can find that optimism is, and you better nail this draft pick, essentially.
Yeah. I mean, and you already said they had, I thought it was the second hardest schedule, maybe after last night
It
or the
might
night
be
before. It's the hardest schedule. They've already played OKC 3 times, which just seems like torture. I think the Nuggets twice,
Minnesota
Minnesota in there.
twice.
So yeah. So it seems harsh. And to be fair to them, they have had a ton of injuries. They haven't had the same starting five, I think, 2 nights in a row with Sabonis out and Murray and all that stuff. So but I do think that you hit on something, is that the hope is that they kind of embrace the suck at this point and just lean into this. It's maybe OKC is the perfect model. It's a very similar thing, right? They're the only show in town. They're a small market team. They have the benefit of maybe being like that contract haven for some of the other teams to get rid of their expiring contracts at the cost of some expensive draft capital, and then you get a bunch of chances. It's like buying another lottery ticket. And the hope is that they take that example and they're able to build on it. I know it's going to be hard for the fans. I'm sure those, like, was it 3-4 years of the process, quote unquote, that was happening in OKC wasn't great for the fans, but they still showed up. It's still fun when you have
My
some young
my
players to
argument
root
would
for
be,
and
would you
stuff.
rather watch like Utah last year or the Kings this year? And I think the answer might be Utah last year, where you get to be like,
Yeah,
hey man, Keontae George, like at least you have some sort of hope.
exactly.
Like I mentioned earlier, the Pelicans are a joke right now as well. Don't get me wrong, but like at
Hmm.
very least from a viewership standpoint, right, and from the fans' point, you get to be like, man, Derek Queen balled out the other night, and like Jeremiah Fears looking pretty good. We don't have our own draft pick. That's his own thing, and that's a mess. But I think like there is something the fans can lean into with these young teams. And that's what a lot of people, and I try to take Twitter for what it's worth, because I think it's kind of vocal minority a little bit sometimes. But a lot of
100%.
that section of the fan base is like, just play the young guys. Like Neat Clifford
Yeah.
didn't play much last night. Devin Carter didn't play last night. They lost by 40 or 30, whatever it was. It felt like 40. And Devin Carter didn't touch the floor. Like Devin Carter hasn't looked good, but like just let the young guys play a little bit. And I think there is a little bit of a misconception sometimes. I'm not saying that you're saying this, obviously, but in general, of what tanking is. And it's really more of embracing your youth and like letting your youth play through
100%.
mistakes. And hey, if they win you games, like so be it. At that point you'll take it. But it's not just let's roll out the worst thing imaginable and try to lose every game.
Yeah, especially in the new tanking or the new lottery rules. I think it's the bottom 4 teams all have the same odds. So it's not like you get much benefit from being the worst team versus the fourth worst team or something like that. So I think it feels like, or my hope is that they're just putting these vets kind of in the shop window saying, hey, look what DeMar DeRozan can still do. He's 38, but he's still playing well. Or Westbrook, or even Levine, who I knew it's probably a harder piece to move. But that's my hope, is they're putting them in the shop window and they're saying, hey, come get these guys. Give us a draft pick or two back, and you can have these guys for a contending team, or someone's looking for a 6-man or whatever it is. But yeah, man, I mean, it's been fun watching this team, or it was fun, those couple years when they were competitive. Not so fun this year, but there is hopefully a light at the end of the tunnel. If this team is starting to work in that direction. It might be tough, but there is optimism, like you said. Where can folks hear more from you? Where can folks see and hear your Kings coverage out there?
Yeah, appreciate you having me on, man. It's King's Pulse podcast and the King's Beat podcast as well. And any sort of writing is on SacTown Sports. Yeah, thanks, man. Appreciate you having me. And sorry to anybody that's had to watch the Kings this year.
I will definitely put the links to all those shows in the episode description. Make sure you guys hit that like and subscribe button wherever you are watching or listening to the 44 Division podcast. And Brenden, thanks again, man. I appreciate you working with me. I know we had a couple missteps here with the
That's my
scheduling, but
fault.
hopefully we can, all good, brother. Hopefully we could do this again sometime. Thanks, man.
Absolutely. Thanks, bro.